Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. My name is Shoaib M. Khan. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Human Rights Lawyers Association. For those not familiar with the association, we're an association of lawyers, students, and others. We're open to anyone with an interest in the law and human rights. We currently have around, over 2,000 members, ranging from undergraduates to judges. So if that's something that interests you, please do consider joining us. We have a range of membership options. Please look out for links in the chat window or on our Twitter feed, and do join us if it's something that interests you. We also run a human rights bursary scheme where we finance and support people who would like to undertake human rights related internships or placements, but they're not able to finance them themselves. So again, we're always looking for people who can, people and organizations who can support us in that. So if that's something that you would be interested in, please do contact us and we can tell you more about that. It's an absolute pleasure to bring you today's wonderful panel. And I'm sure the next 90 minutes are just going to fly by. So just a few housekeeping points first. Firstly, there is a live stream on YouTube too, in case anyone who's on Zoom right now gets disconnected, isn't able to rejoin, or if you want to share that link with anyone who wasn't able to be here on Zoom, so they can attend via YouTube. Also, please feel free to tweet about the event and share comments about it. So you can tweet using the hashtag HRLASB. People in the Zoom event can ask questions throughout the discussion. Please use the Q&A function for that. Please include any name for yourself that you would like to be read out or mentioned. Otherwise, you can just ask us anonymous or using a pseudonym. In case of any technical difficulties or any other questions or queries or any comments other than questions for the Q&A, please use the chat function for that rather than the Q&A box. People who are not on Zoom, i.e. people on the live stream, can tweet their questions to the HRLA account using, again, the same hashtag. Also, just so you're aware, the event is being recorded. So in terms of any interactions or your name for questions, please keep that in mind. If you have any further questions about that or anything else, please email the HRLA and we can clarify for you. Finally, just to reassure everyone, we do aim to finish by 7:45, so we will be done in time for the start of the bake-off final. So just so that everyone's reassured about that. So now to introduce the brilliant panel we have tonight, even though I'm quite sure most of them, all of them, they need no introduction. We really are delighted and honored that they're with us tonight. The first panelist, obviously, is the Secret Barrister. So I don't really know what I can say to introduce them, since no one really knows who they are. But they're a barrister specializing in criminal law, an author and a blogger. They've written for numerous newspapers, including The Times, Guardian, many other publications. They're regularly quoted across print and broadcast media. They were named Independent Blogger of the Year for 2 years running. They were named Legal Personality of the Year at the Law Society Awards. Their first book, Stories of the Law and How It's Broken, was a Sunday Times #1 bestseller, remained in the top 10 bestseller list for over a year. Their new book, Fake Law, published in September 2020, was immediately a Sunday Times bestseller. So we're absolutely delighted that they're joining us here today. Our second panelist is Joshua Rosenberg, a solicitor, legal journalist, broadcaster, commentator, the only journalist ever to have been appointed honorary QC. He's an honorary master of the bench at Gray's Inn, a non-executive board member of the Law Commission. He's previously been the BBC's legal correspondent, legal editor of The Telegraph. In 2012, he was included by The Times in its list of the UK's 100 most influential lawyers, the only journalist to feature in that list. His latest book, also published earlier this year, is Enemies of the People, How Judges Shape Society. So we're really pleased he's joining us this evening. Our third panelist this evening is Joanna Hardy. Again, really needs no introduction. She's a criminal barrister at Red Lion Chambers. She is listed in the Legal 500. The edition describes her as an absolute star, well-deserved high profile, skilled advocate, etc. In addition to her busy criminal practice, she regularly writes and speaks about the criminal justice system. And she was recently listed in the Evening Standard's Progress 1000, a list of the most influential people in London. So we're really fortunate she's joined us this evening. Finally, voicing the Secret Barrister this evening, we're very pleased that Joanne Kane is able to join us. So we're assured that she's not the Secret Barrister, and she's only voicing them for this evening. She's a barrister at Carmelite Chambers, specializes in serious crime and fraud cases. She is vice chair of the Young Barristers Committee, and an elected member of the Bar Council. She is also a member of the Female Fraud Forum. We are really grateful that she's joining us this evening. That's all for me for now. I will now hand over to Joanna Hardy for the main part of this evening's discussion. Joanna.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people logged in, particularly after lockdown. It's nice to have the legal community sort of back together again, maybe one day back in the same room, but we'll take this for now. It's a real pleasure this evening to be in conversation with Joshua Rosenberg and the Secret Barrister. I don't know about many of you, but when I was a law student, I lived and breathed Joshua Rosenberg's writings and his programs. I was convinced that as long as I was keeping up to date with what he wrote and what he said, that I wouldn't go far wrong. And then as I matured and became a junior barrister, I joined in with the howling and the rage of the Secret Barrister blog, and then drank in the books, which I'm sure you all did too. So it's a real pleasure of mine to be here. I'm a big fan of both of our speakers this evening. Someone's already sent me a question: who will win the bake-off? So thank you for that, whoever's really paying attention to what I'm saying into the evening, because obviously Peter will win the bake-off. I have got my first question this evening on quite a contemporary topic, quite a topic that has got a lot of people's backs up. And Joshua, really, the title of your book, Enemies of the People, is taken from a now notorious headline criticising judges. And similarly, recently we've heard criticism of lawyers from the Home Secretary and others. And my first question to both of you is this: does it really matter if politicians show respect to judges and lawyers, or are we all being a little bit precious? Joshua, what do you think about that topic?
It's a very good question, and if you were asking the Prime Minister, he would say that lawyers are being a bit precious, and that if lawyers do the wrong thing, then they should be criticised, and that's obviously right. The problem, however, is the risks that the public will think that lawyers are corrupt. Some are, but very few. That lawyers are in it for themselves. Some are, but very few. And that people will not understand what lawyers are there for. And lawyers are there to help their clients, to support their clients, to protect their clients, to speak for their clients, to speak in a way that their clients can't speak because they don't have the experience of speaking in court, and of course to give legal advice. And legal advice is terribly important. If you, as a lawyer, Joanna, ever have a problem, and you know, I don't profess to be a lawyer, but I've had problems in my time, and I have thought, well, I know the law, I know what to do. But, you know, a person who is his or her own lawyer has a fool for a client. And if you try and advise yourself, you will give yourself bad advice. You must go to somebody else. It helps if that person's a lawyer. So lawyers are terribly important in society. And all right, these two criticisms by the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister were at the party conference. And they were party political knockabout for their supporters. But these things do matter because people take them seriously. And if people lose respect for lawyers in general, lawyers as a whole, then we are all the poorer.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it was said at the party political conference. And I think that I heard someone commentating recently saying, well, Shakespeare said bad things about lawyers. And I thought, well, we shouldn't really take that as our benchmark, because I think Shakespeare said we should all be killed. So it's really interesting that where it comes from and who it comes from and how it's delivered is important. Joanne, has the Secret Barrister got any thoughts on that talking point?
Yes, they do. I'm just waiting for them to come through. But what I can tell you in the meantime is that Peter is going to win Bake Off. So while that's coming through, here we go. So on behalf of the Secret Barrister, they say, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. Peter is going to win Bake Off. It's a question I've asked myself quite a bit, especially as I find myself mounting my Twitter high horse more and more in recent years in light of various comments made by government ministers. Is it actually that much of an issue, or is it simply an instinctive defensive reaction to criticism which I don't like, but which falls within the bounds of legitimate comment? And doing my best not to be prickly and to look at it objectively, or as objectively as possible, I do think the tone and content of recent comments are problematic because the criticism isn't, for the most part, aimed at feelings among the legal profession. And let's not kid ourselves, we are not all perfect. Sometimes we don't do our jobs as well as we should, but it's aimed at stirring up public antagonism towards us for just doing our job. The problem, it is insinuated, is that barristers are representing unpopular causes or unpopular clients, or are representing people bringing claims against the government, or that judges are making rulings that don't meet with government approval. Lawyers who, to use a recent popular example, represent asylum seekers are all left-wing activists because representing an individual against the state is apparently an act of left-wing activism, which may come as a surprise to traditional conservatives. But there you go. Judges who rule against the Home Office find themselves the victims of briefings by unnamed Downing Street sources denouncing them for wading into politics. And the combined effect of these messages is to suggest that a lawyer representing an individual or judge reaching an independent decision in a case is guilty of a moral or ethical or professional failing. And as we all well know, without independent lawyers representing individuals, and without independent judges deciding cases according to law and evidence, the rule of law crumbles. And that, the rule of law, is the victim here. It's not our egos, bruised as they may be, and undoubtedly precious as we are. And we are. The damage is not disrespect to lawyers, but in the steady and deliberate undermining of the rule of law. If the public can be convinced that justice is defined not by due process and independent decision-making and the right to representation, but instead solely by whether the outcome accords with our personal or political preferences, or worse, whether it accords with the government's political agenda, then faith in those fundamental principles becomes eroded. And from there, it will not be easy to get it back. Something I should add is that this isn't new, of course. As I look at in fake law, first and only plug, I promise, there are examples of politicians lambasting lefty human rights lawyers for decades, whether Tony Blair, Jack Straw, or David Blunkett under New Labour, or Chris Grayling and Theresa May, or as with now, Boris Johnson and Priti Patel. Criticising lawyers and whipping up public animosity is a tried and tested way of scoring points with tabloids, distracting from whatever you don't want to be scrutinised. There's something in the tone of recent years, and perhaps linked to our media and social media culture, that makes the threat feel far more real. We probably, in truth, laughed off earlier attacks on our independence and integrity when we should have directly confronted the false premises upon which they're based.
It's so interesting that I was saying at the beginning about how when I was a law student and started reading both of our panelists' work, it's almost like going back to the cab rank rule, back to the beginning. You know, we take the cases we're given, we don't politically choose them, which is such a basic tenet of what we do, but something that's so often overlooked. The follow-up question to all of that must be this. We have seen an awful lot of what looks like law in politics, and I say that because we've seen the Miller cases, we've seen the asylum objections on the front page of newspapers, we've seen the recent report into the Labour Party, which is almost a legalistic mechanism. Joshua, what do you think we should say to people who argue that lawyers and judges are meddling in politics?
Or what should we say to politicians who try meddling in the law? I mean, you see the story today of one or two members of parliament who are meant to have written to a judge to ask her to handle a case in a particular way. But to answer your question, what should be said about that? Judges in the United Kingdom are not elected. They are not nominated by political parties. They don't profess support for a particular party. When you get members of the Supreme Court elected, they are elected without anybody really noticing or caring, because there's a widespread belief that pretty well all judges are middle of the road, they don't have particular views, and it's not really possible to tell a judge's politics, and that's how they like it. There are one or two members of the bar, a few solicitors who are very well known, but they tend not to become judges. So on the whole, our judiciary tend to be pretty neutral. That's not to say they don't have strong views. Of course they do. That's not to say that they don't have very clear views as to where they see justice lying and where they see the result of any particular case. But nevertheless, they have to follow the law. There was a judgment today, for example, about a woman called Anne Secoulis. She's the American woman who was allowed to leave the United Kingdom after she was involved in a road accident in Northamptonshire, which led to the death of Harry Dunn. And what the High Court, a Lord Justice of Appeal and a High Court judge, decided today was that she had immunity. She had diplomatic immunity. She also had inviolability. She couldn't have been arrested anyway. And they said that they didn't come to this judgment with any, I can't remember the exact quote, but they weren't very pleased with it, the two judges said, any great satisfaction, any great pleasure. They clearly didn't like having to reach that decision. It isn't a popular decision. A lot of people want to see Anne Secoulis stand trial in the United Kingdom. But nevertheless, they looked at the Vienna Convention on the interpretation of treaties and decided that as a matter of law, she had immunity. That was how it was phrased. It was probably a terrible mistake. It probably was not intended. Her husband had waived his immunity, but her immunity was not waived. She had immunity. She was allowed to leave the United Kingdom, and that was the right decision. Whether it was the right decision as a matter of principle, whether it was justice, you can argue about. But their job was to lay down the law, and that's what they've done. I should say that case is apparently going to the Court of Appeal, or at least that's a request by Harry Dunn's parents.
It's really interesting when you read or perceive a judgment that you think might have been given with a heavy heart almost, but given all the same, as you say, cutting through perhaps different interpretations of what justice might look like. Joshua, does the Secret Barrister have any views on that, Joanne?
Yes, they say I agree, and I expect this will be my default with Joshua entirely. I think the first point to hammer home, and it sounds simple, but that's because it is that the courts are only interested in law. Many legal cases have nothing to do with politics at all. A breach of contract claim for a botched dog grooming service, for instance, is not political. Many political issues have no legal dimension. For example, who the Prime Minister appoints to his cabinet or hires as his special advisor, and the courts have no role in overseeing those. And then in the middle, you have legal cases which do have a political dimension, in which the legal outcome may have wider political consequences. But the key point is that judges are only allowed to get involved if the case before them engages an arguable principle of law, and decisions made by the court are not based on their political preferences or on the basis that they agree or disagree with the merits of a policy, but by applying established legal principles. I think there is often a fairly widespread misapprehension that anybody can bring a disagreement before a court for a legally binding decision, and judges will merrily wade in to bang a gavel and quote a legal gloss over any old nonsense. And the notion that there are strict rules of justiciability is one we don't seem to have successfully communicated to the public. I think we need to. But the second point, which may or may not sit comfortably alongside what I've just said, and yes, this is the level of coherence you can expect from my standard jury speech, is this: law, to some extent, is inherently political. Laws are the rules that are democratically made by people whom we democratically elect to reflect and uphold our own political views. Any exercise that involves the application and particularly the interpretation of those rules is almost inescapably bound to be political. When, as with judicial review, the courts are applying legal principles to executive acts, their decision will have to be, pardon me, Twitter timeout.
Can I chip in at that point, Joanna?
Yeah.
Because just while the Twitter is recovering,
Mm.
I mean, I agree with SB on that, but I think when SB speaks about political, I think SB, and I'm going to call SB her because I find it easier than there. When she says it's political, I think she doesn't mean it's party political. And I think there's a distinction to be drawn between that. Yes, judges take decisions, and politics broadly is about how you decide between competing options, competing desirabilities. But it doesn't have to be party political. Can I, while I have the floor, just give you the exact quote that I was trying to remember a moment ago. This is paragraph 119 from the judgment today of Lord Justice Flo and Mr. Justice Saini in the Harry Dunn case. Our conclusion is that Mrs. Sakoulas enjoyed immunity from UK jurisdiction at the time of Harry's death. We do not come to this conclusion with any enthusiasm for the result, but it is compelled by the operation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. That's what I was trying to remember.
Yes, and I think that really encapsulates the tone of a professional doing their job, which at its very core is what we ask our judiciary to do day in, day out. So I think it's really interesting that Secret Barrister says, you know, there's this perception that a conga line of increasingly unpopular litigants are streaming into the High Court day in, day out. And sometimes they are unpopular cases, but sometimes they're very mundane cases that create law that affects millions of people. We just don't hear about them as much. So I thought that was well observed. Joanna, are you back up and running with your...
Yeah, so what they were going on to say was, when, as with judicial review, the courts are applying legal principles to executive acts, their decision will have immediate relevance to policy. And they were going on to say, and to politics, but that can't mean and doesn't mean that it's wrong or improper for judges to hear them. Where somebody affected by the act of a public authority believes that that act is unlawful and the public authority disagrees, there has to be an independent mechanism to resolve that dispute, and that is all that the courts are doing. Problems may well arise where judges, in arriving at their decisions, supplant legal principles with their own personal politics. But fortunately, I think there is precious little evidence of that being an issue in our system, something that I think Joshua's book illustrates only too well. Another thing which I also think is a feature particular to the current political mood is a rather absolutist view of executive power. I think few would disagree that politics, not just in the UK, but in the US as well, has become more polarized since 2015. Nuance, compromise, and reaching across the political aisle, these feel like pretty antiquated concepts among politicians and the electorate. Instead, there's a winner takes it all feel about politics. I certainly perceive that attitude among ministers, although let me be plain, they are by no means the first to hold this attitude. It's a we won the election, therefore we get to act how we like. It's of course a misrepresentation of how our constitution works, but its simplicity is beguiling. And in this paradigm, when you have judges or lawyers saying, actually, you don't get to act how you like, acting as a brake on executive power, it's easy to mischaracterize that as an act of political obstinacy, as the judges being on the other team's side rather than being the referee.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head. And when we think about how often we hear the phrase the will of the people, or how often, for example, the Brexit vote is used or deployed to justify various things, it's incredible the spread of it. And set against that context, Joshua, your book title may start with the words enemies of the people, but it ends with a conclusion that our judiciary may be just about the only friends we have And apart from being a beautiful line, and your book is beautifully written, but that closer I thought was particularly well written. But that aside, what did you mean?
What did I mean? I meant I'd got to the end of the book and I needed a concluding phrase. What I meant was
You're
that,
very modest. For anyone that hasn't read Joshua's book, it's substantively and beautifully written. But what did you mean in substance, Joshua, by that?
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, if I start with the title "Enemies of the People," and it does have a question mark, the Daily Mail headline did not. The Daily Mail headline was quite clear that the judges who ruled in favour of Gina Miller, who decided that legislation was needed to trigger Brexit in Miller 1, those judges were somehow trying to block Brexit. And what I argue on that case is that far from blocking Brexit, they were simply saying that the decision on who should trigger Brexit shouldn't be one for the Prime Minister and her cabinet, it should be one for Parliament. They said that legislation was needed to trigger Brexit. Now, you can say, well, maybe deep down they thought MPs wouldn't vote for it. But the fact is that Theresa May had a majority in Parliament at that time. And as it turned out, and as we could see it was likely to turn out, she had no difficulty in getting the legislation through that she needed to give notice under Article 50. So I don't think they were enemies of the people on this occasion. They were supporting the people by giving the decision on whether to trigger Brexit to Parliament as representing the people. And you can say the same for Miller number 2, the prorogation case, where they decided that the Prime Minister alone couldn't use prerogative powers to advise the Queen to suspend Parliament. It was up to Parliament to carry on debating Brexit at what seemed to be a crucial time in the process, and that power was not to be within the hands of the Prime Minister, perhaps supported by his cabinet, but was to be in the hands of MPs and peers in Parliament. So they were supporting Parliament. And in that sense, they were supporting the people. And in that sense, you could say they were friends of the people rather than enemies of the people. But I do think that, I want to pick up SB's point about politics here. I do think that judges are in a delicate role, as well as being in a role where I do hope they have some respect. I suspect that the public have less respect for political leaders these days. I suspect they have no respect whatsoever, nor should they, for people who do what I do, which is journalism. Indeed, there are very few jobs in public life. Civil servants, I think, have been traduced, particularly in recent months. Special advisors, well, we can say what we think about them. The police have run into problems. Prosecutors have, had difficulties. So really, who's left? Well, you could say the military, but leaving the military aside for this purpose, who do people trust? Who do politicians go to when they need somebody to investigate something that's gone wrong? Well, it's the judiciary. Now, how far the judiciary are sensitive to the public mood in reaching the decisions they do is a very subtle and interesting question, and one I don't know the answer to necessarily. I didn't think that Gina Miller was going to win her first case, because I thought that the judges would be afraid of the headlines that they did in fact get, that they were enemies of the people because they were supposedly blocking Brexit. And I thought they wouldn't want to suffer the damage that they got from the headlines in the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and the Express and the Sun and other newspapers. But they clearly thought that, perhaps they didn't know what they were going to get, but they clearly thought it was a price to pay, and it was very, very important to do what they saw as the right thing, which is to ensure that Parliament had the decision rather than the executive. And although I think they were sensitive to politics, and I think they are sensitive to politics, I think they're very sensitive to the public mood, particularly on sentencing, particularly on issues such as this. Ultimately, they are there to uphold the law and to develop the law, and the book is really about how they develop the law, how far they should go, how far they shouldn't go, where it should go.
And Joshua, do you think that the almost easy target of the judiciary would be a little less easy and a target if our judiciary were more diverse? Do you think that the argument that either they're out of touch, or depending on which side of the fence you are, they're the flog 'em and hang 'em brigade, or then we see wild headlines about them betraying the will of the people, do you think they'd be less of an easy target if they looked and sounded and came from backgrounds that were more like the people?
I think the answer to that is no. I mean, coming back to the story I was reading today about these complaints by MPs, most of them women as far as I recall, they were complaining about a High Court judge, female, and they were writing to the President of the Queen's Bench Division and the senior presiding judge, both of them female. So the three judges mentioned in this story today were all women. They were not from ethnic minorities, but they were all women. And I think that there is certainly scope for increasing the diversity of the judiciary, and we're all in favour of that, absolutely no doubt. But I wonder whether people would feel less critical of the judges if they happened to be former solicitors, for example, rather than former barristers, as not many High Court judges are. I like to think that judges are judged on their merits, on their skills, on their abilities, on their judgment, rather than on their backgrounds.
And Joanne, does the Secret Barrister have views on that topic?
Yes. They begin by saying, I'm with Joshua again. I don't think that diversity would actually dispel criticism, for the reason I don't think that the out of touch moniker is deployed in those circumstances as a good faith criticism. It's just an easy pejorative, a familiar brickbat to throw at judges when they make an unpopular decision. I think this is illustrated by the diversity of political views attributed to judges, which varies depending on the critic. To some, judges are out of touch, lily-livered liberals in Islington ivory towers. To others, they are out of touch, right-wing conservative dinosaurs upholding the status quo. I'm not saying that those criticisms are necessarily always substantively wrong, but I think out of touch has been rendered meaningless through unfocused overuse. So I don't think that improving diversity would affect those criticisms. I think sadly that the spirit of our current politics is such that decisions which are unpopular or which are reported in such a way as to make them unpopular will still be met with criticism that judges are out of touch, irrespective of the composition of the judiciary. I know that sounds pessimistic. That all said, the more important point is that the judiciary does need to be more diverse. That much has been plain for a long time, throughout the history of the judiciary, in fact, unless Henry II's favourite knights were a particularly diverse bunch. For reasons which I hope people are starting to see as self-evident, the legal system has to reflect the public it serves. And although I don't think this will quell accusations of being out of touch, increasing diversity should mean that, as a matter of fact, judges are more in touch with the life experiences of those over whom they sit in judgment. It should make a substantive difference to our laws and to our legal culture. In Enemies of the People, Joshua discusses the impact of Lady Hale when she became the president of the Supreme Court. She not only brought a perspective that had been absent from the highest court in the land since its inception, but made huge efforts to improve the gender balance among the judiciary and to encourage women in the law. This, I hope, is just the beginning.
Yeah, you use the word pessimism. It's sad to think that even if we were to achieve all of the goals we've set for diversity, both in the legal profession and in the judiciary, that the insults would still come from the left and from the right. And I agree that the criticisms we see don't often make sense, because one moment a judge is too tough, they're, a sergeant major out of touch and a disciplinarian, and the next moment the criticism seems to be that everybody's a wafty, lefty activist. And it's almost like you want to ask people to make up their minds as to which criticism to rest on. Robert Buckland has promised a review into the Human Rights Act, and this is a human rights event, so I'm sure some of the people watching may know more about this than we do in detail, but one person who knows quite a lot about it, because I read an article yesterday, Joshua, is you. What do you think that we can expect from a review of the Human Rights Act?
It's a strange review. I mean, Robert Buckland, the Lord Chancellor, gave evidence last week to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, chaired by Harriet Harman, MPs and peers. And he answered quite a lot of questions, if you look carefully at what he said. The first thing he said is that he's not seeking to take the UK out of the Human Rights Convention. I think we know that. The second thing is he's not seeking to repeal the Human Rights Act. I think we know that. But he is concerned about the way in which the Human Rights Convention is interpreted by the courts. And he mentioned specifically sections 2, 3 and 4 of the Human Rights Act, which tell the courts how to deal with the Human Rights Convention, what weight to give it, when it's binding, when it's not, and so on, what they should do about decisions of the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. They should take those into account, what they should do if legislation is incompatible with the Human Rights Convention. They can't overturn primary legislation. They can read down, which means rewrite secondary legislation. And he questioned whether those particular provisions were still appropriate. Now, he mentioned the margin of appreciation, which is Strasbourg jargon for discretion, for room for manoeuvre that courts in this country have when applying the Human Rights Convention. And what he seemed to be hinting at was that maybe the courts should have more discretion. In other words, they should have more room for manoeuvre, more opportunity to depart from what the Strasbourg court has decided. Now, if that were to happen, if Parliament were to rewrite those sections of the Human Rights Act so that the judges had more scope for manoeuvre, then one of two things could happen, or both. But there are two options, really. Either the judges will say, well, we've got more discretion, but we think that the Strasbourg court is pretty well right. It seems to be pulling its punches these days. It hasn't really caused any trouble for the UK. We'll follow its reasoning, we'll follow its jurisprudence, and we'll go along with what it says, in which case nothing changes. The judges have more discretion, but they choose to exercise it in the same way as they are exercising it now. Or, alternatively, they decide not to follow the Strasbourg jurisprudence. In other words, they choose not to be bound by decisions taken by the Human Rights Court, in which case the law of the United Kingdom will diverge from the law as laid down by the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, in which case there will be more cases going to the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, in which case there will be more defeats for the UK government. Now, that's what the Lord Chancellor is thinking. What he's doing is he is setting up a review. It is, we're told, similar to the independent review of administrative law called IRAL, the one under Lord Folkes, the one that was appointed in July and is meant to report by the end of this year. As Robert Buckland said, that review has some very independently minded people on it. You may say that the chair is a former Conservative Justice Minister, but the members of the panel are distinguished QCs and others involved in human rights, and I don't think anybody could say which way their political views go. So Robert Buckland wants something similar to look at the Human Rights Act. He wants a review. They will report to him. He will then produce some sort of white paper, and the government will presumably lead to legislation fortified, one may say, by the findings of this report, which I suppose we'll get sometime next year. That seems to be what he seems to be doing.
Yes, I'm sure that they'll hear your words, Joshua, and try and guard against more rather than fewer defeats, of which they take with such good grace. Secret Barrister, do you think that we need a review, or do you think that the Human Rights Act does a pretty good job?
So the Secret Barrister says, in the finest traditions of clumsily sidestepping a difficult question, I'm going to respond by answering a slightly different one, because I'm not a human rights lawyer and so can't give you the benefit of an insight gained from practice. I'm not the best person to talk about how it works on the ground. I have no doubt that, like in all areas of the law, it is capable of improvement, and no doubt, again, like all areas of the law, it would benefit from the luxury of a longitudinal independent review approached with no prior agenda and with a genuine intention to improve its operation. but that's not what this is. It's a review which, like the independent review of administrative law, is set up with a predetermined, or at least strongly desired, conclusion, namely that the Human Rights Act, like judicial review, isn't working because it is making the job of governing more difficult. It creates embarrassment when human rights work to protect unpopular people, foreign nationals with criminal convictions being the favourite tabloid ghoul. And don't forget, it has been the express policy of the governing party since the mid-2000s to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Human Rights, whatever that's supposed to look like. So I'm not against a review in principle, but my fear is that the political momentum for this has been built on years of mischaracterizations of how the Human Rights Act works, and that the outcome is basically pre-scripted. There will be further reform of some shape, some further fetter on the power of judges. I hear what Mr. Buckland said in evidence about giving judges more discretion, but I have to say I'm slightly sceptical. Politicians rarely want to give judges more of a free rein, and when they do, rarely sit silently as judges enjoy it.
Can I chip in here, Joanna? It's interesting that SB refers to the Commission on a UK Bill of Rights, which was something set up under the coalition government in 2011, and because it was a coalition-led review, it had half the members were Conservatives and half were nominated by the Liberal Democrats, and needless to say they couldn't agree and it got nowhere. And what Robert Buckland said last week was that he didn't intend to follow that. He is clearly, as SB very correctly says, going into this with a particular agenda of his own. He could have simply published a proposal, white paper, put it out for consultation, ignored the responses and gone ahead with legislation. He's not choosing to do that. So either, if you want to be really cynical, he's just wants a bit more time and then he'll push all this through and he'll say, look, this commission backed me. Or maybe there's something going on in Whitehall which we can't quite see, which means that on the one side, you've got the people who drafted the manifesto commitment, who have the opposition to human rights that SB has quoted, and on the other hand, you've got the judges who say, look, all we're doing is following the law as laid down by Parliament. If you don't like what we're doing, change the law. And he is holding the ring. I wrote this piece on my blog yesterday, and I headlined it that the subhead was it's not as radical as you might think. And there was immediate response on Twitter from a barrister who's very active on Twitter, Adam Wagner, a guy I know very well and respect a very great deal. And he said, well, it may not be as radical as it was going to be, but it's still far too radical. They simply should do absolutely nothing about human rights and leave it exactly as it is. Well, that's fine. That's a perfectly respectable view. But there's also a view that really we should scrap the lot of it. And you get that in some areas of the Conservative Party, I dare say. And what Buckland seems to me to be doing is to try to find a middle way between those two options. You can say that I'm naive, but I'm prepared to wait and see, first of all, what his inquiry comes up with, and more importantly, what he then proposes as a result.
Yes, I mean, we haven't got time to talk about it this evening, but that proposed review of the Human Rights Act and what it will look like and its parameters, I find a similar question in my own mind about the Supreme Court. Any review or consultation into that, what will it look like? What will the parameters be? We haven't got time to go into all of that this evening, but it's a parallel that I see in questioning quite where are we going with reviews of things and what is the outcome likely to be. Now, you're both known and praised, if I may say so, for explaining complex legal decisions in everyday language. And I think that the ascent of social media has really exposed that, where you have quite a hungry public audience, quite complex, high-profile legal cases, and people who are able to explain them. Notwithstanding that, we've seen quite frequently cases where the public or the media have got the wrong end of the stick about a case, and they've misunderstood either the legal decision being made or the legal question being asked. I wonder if you could each set out an example of that and how you think we might counter it. Joshua, do you want to consider that first while SB communicates through the wavelength? Quite a long question for him or her to type.
Yes, and you know, the short answer is that people should try to get their news and their analysis from as many sources as possible. They should certainly read SB's book, which very, very clearly exposes the failures and weaknesses of the media. I particularly like his introduction, which throws together a series of errors, several in every sentence, and just delivers this as an introduction. You know, the question is how far you get down this page and a half before you spot errors about judges banging gavels and, you know, and I haven't made this up, it was a cat, and all these cliches that are all totally wrong about Britain's unelected judges, and, you know, sending a child to his death in order to save the National Health Service money. All these things have been reported in the press, and SB has simply gathered them together to show how that these are so misleading. Some of them are malicious, some of them are ignorant. An awful lot of people imagine that people have gavels. When I used to work in the BBC, and we used to have to do graphics for television news, the graphic designers would always produce a gavel because a gavel has movement. It goes like that, tries not to bang microphone, and it has sound. It has a knock. So they love that. And you have to say, well, they don't have gavels in the courts in the United Kingdom. And they say, no. And you say, no, they don't. And they say, but I saw that television reconstruction, that drama, that wasn't Perry Mason, showing my age now. That wasn't an old American legal drama. That was set in the courts in this case. That might have been Jeremy Thorpe case, where the barristers were walking around the court. And they say, well, I saw it on television. And of course, the set designers and all the people just throw it all in, and it's a self-perpetuating myth. So don't believe everything you say. You asked about a case. The case I've thought about is the case of Hurst, H-I-R-S-T. Hurst was a prisoner who complained he couldn't vote. Hurst was the case about which David Cameron said, it makes me physically sick to think that we've got to give prisoners the vote. That was misunderstood because in the end the Hurst case was settled after 12 or 13 years by David Lidington, who was Lord Chancellor, making such a minor change to the rights of remand prisoners to vote that I describe it in my book as almost homeopathic. Nobody noticed it. Nobody was aware that this reform had gone through. It certainly didn't require MPs to vote or anything like that. It was possible to satisfy the Council of Europe, which supervises decisions or supervises the implementation of decisions of the Human Rights Court. It was possible to satisfy the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers that the UK had done all that was necessary to comply with the court's judgment. There was no need to give large numbers of prisoners the vote. There was no need for any Prime Minister to throw up. It was a case which was much misunderstood. You could argue that Strasbourg realised it made a terrible mistake and backed down and allowed this compromise, which amounted to nothing at all. But it was certainly reported as saying that all prisoners were going to have to vote or going to have the right to vote, and that's not what the court ever said.
Thank you so much. As always, in your characteristic style, you explain it so well, and you wonder how anyone got confused in the first place, but perhaps it's because they haven't bought both of your books. Joanne, fake law is jammed to the rafters with examples like this. Has the Secret Barrister communicated to you their best example?
Well, they've named this part 1. So they've said the case I will choose, because although it's old, it keeps reincarnating itself every few years, is the case of Tony Martin, the farmer who shot dead a burglar in 1997. He was a celebrated folk hero in the tabloids for having taken, it was said, action that any one of us would have taken. And his conviction for murder, later reduced to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, was reported as an example of how the law of self-defense operates against the individual, i.e. the law is on the side of the burglar. And this theme spurred not only political campaigns, but repeated efforts by successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, to reform the law of self-defense, which they did. And I'm just waiting for the second part of that to load, but it's in here already. What was missed time and time again is what the law of self-defense actually says. And it holds by common law, as now reflected in statute, is that if you genuinely believe the use of force is necessary, you can use such force as is reasonable. Reasonable means proportionate. And so that gives you a pretty wide margin of appreciation, which is why, contrary to the idea that innocent householders are routinely prosecuted for attacking burglars, it hardly ever happens. Now I'm just waiting for some more.
I might actually be super rude and cut SB off there because I've got one eye on the Times.
I'll finish with this last sentence
Go
then.
on.
They go on to say, and of course, in Tony Martin's case, he didn't use reasonable force. He lay in wait for a burglar he knew was approaching and shot him. He had previously threatened to do just this at a meeting. So that's the Secret Barrister's response to that.
Yeah, and anyone who's got fake law will see the chapter on self-defense, and the whole book is obviously a tour de force, but on home ground criminal law, that chapter is my favourite from that book. It's beautifully written. I'm going to cough, excuse me. It's not anything to worry about in the current climate. A very unpopular thing to do at the moment, coughing. Now, I'm probably meant to stick to law and heavyweight stuff, but before I get stopped and cut off, I'm going to ask some gossipy questions. So, Joshua, you trained as a solicitor originally, but you've obviously established yourself as the nation's favourite and best legal journalist. But when you're looking at the lawyers in court and the lawyers you report on, do you ever wish that you could enter the fray?
I suppose I do, really. I rather like sort of standing up in the press bench and making an application on behalf of the media for reporting restrictions to be lifted or something like that. It's quite scary to begin with, but after a while it gets better. And obviously, if you know the judges, or if you knew them when they were barristers, or if you knew them when they were junior barristers, as you know, when you get to my age, you do. It makes it slightly easier. So yes, I am an advocate manqué, I suppose. And I suppose if I'm being really honest, and if I wanted to, if I had known that I was going to join a branch of the law in order to leave it immediately, I might have tried for the bar. I didn't think I was clever enough for the bar. I thought I was quite good at sort of filing and paperwork and things like that. So I thought I was more suited to being a solicitor. But in the end, I haven't been either. So it really doesn't matter.
Well, I wouldn't want to come up against you when you were making an application for reporting restrictions. I think you'd be a formidable opponent. Your Radio 4 show, Law in Action, launched in 1984. We won't ask who was or wasn't born, Joshua. We won't ask the panel that. But in all of those years, who has been your most memorable guest, or what has been your most memorable moment?
Well, I hate questions like that because I can't really remember. But so I'm actually going to name the man who was, well, he wasn't the last guest on the most recent programme last week, but he was the last voice that we heard. And that was a man called Jack Merritt, who was murdered almost a year ago this weekend. He was murdered at Fishmongers Hall, London Bridge, by a terrorist. Along with a woman called Saskia Jones, and they were involved in an organisation called Learning Together. He ran it, she was a volunteer, and this was a way in which prisoners could study alongside Cambridge graduates, Cambridge undergraduates, students at another college in Cambridge, not part of the university, another university in Cambridge. Anglia Ruskin, wasn't it? Anyway, they would go into prison and study in the same room as the prisoners. And we went to see this last year at a prison in Suffolk, Warren Hill. And it was extraordinary to see how prisoners, many of whom had not had very much of an advantage in life, were studying alongside Cambridge undergraduates, not all of whom came from wealthy backgrounds, but all of whom had at least been, able to study and to get to university. And Jack Merritt saw promise in both sides, obviously in his fellow students, he was a student himself, but also in these prisoners. And we interviewed a former prisoner who had been serving an IPP, is currently on licence for a firearms offence, a man called Roscoe Onya, who dedicated a rap tune to Jack Merritt and said that Jack Merritt had helped him to get through the courses which you need to do if you're an IPP prisoner on an indeterminate sentence for public protection in order to get released on licence. So if I'm going to remember anybody, it's Jack Merritt. And I remember, obviously, having interviewed him last spring and hearing, at the end of last year that he'd been murdered. It was a shocking thing. And I'd only met him once. And for people who knew him well, his family and everybody else, it was a deeply, deeply distressing thing. As I say, the anniversary is imminent, the end of this month. The inquest will be next spring, and we'll hear a lot more about that in the future. And I hope we'll all remember Jack Merritt.
Yes, of course. And I think that as that story unfolded to all of us watching the horrors of that day, it almost unfolded in a way that our initial horror that that act of violence could have been committed, and then to learn of the context of the people who were giving people a second chance. And I think as lawyers, we are often in the business of giving second chances. I think it really struck a chord, obviously, with the whole population, but with people associated to the legal community and the rehabilitation workforce. I think that you're right in how you describe it in such a moving way, Joshua. Secret Barrister, you are famous for your books in the general public. I imagine Fake Law will be in most Christmas stockings this year up and down the country. But the die-hard fans, the original fans, before it was cool, we used to read the blog back in the day. And I just wanted to ask you a few questions. Firstly, why did you start the blog? Secondly, what did you hope to achieve by doing it? Have you succeeded now? Is this it? Is this the peak? And when will you stop?
They respond saying, before I answer, let me make it clear. The die-hard fans will get their rewards when I ascend to power. You will not have been forgotten. I started, they say, because my partner tired of me coming home every night and repeating the same old complaints about the state of the criminal justice system, and instructed me that I was starting a Twitter account and a blog, and this would be my outlet from now on. Thank you, dear. Initially, I only hoped to achieve catharsis. I didn't think anyone would read it, and I assumed I'd give up after a few blog posts. Things rather spiraled from there. Beyond that, I hoped that I'd be able to share the reality of the criminal justice system with people who I thought would be interested, but weren't getting an accurate picture. From most commentary, you would think that the only problem with the criminal courts is that the nasty crims aren't getting long enough sentences, and it baffled me that there could be so much wrong that people didn't know about. I hope that I've succeeded in that aim, and hopefully a few more people are now aware.
And secondly, for the Secret Barrister, if you'd known then what you know now about how successful the book has been, and just how large a public profile you'd have, if you could do it all again, would you still be anonymous?
Just waiting for the response. I can see it's coming. Oh, so the response is, hell's yes. I just could not do this under my real name. I need the freedom to speak critically without keeping one panicked eye on what my chambers or judges or the CPS thought. It also means people can wrongly speculate that I'm somebody far more successful than I actually am. Right now, for instance, I'm apparently leader of the opposition, which is very nice to hear. And I've got something more coming through. Anonymity is also, I'm gently reminded by someone close to me, important to stop my ego becoming even more intolerable.
And my final question for the evening does go to the Secret Barrister, and it's a really cheeky question, and I'm sure that they won't want to answer it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And that's, are they able to give us just one exclusive clue as to who they might be?
The response is coming.
We'll probably just say no.
I can tell you one thing, SB can type extremely quickly, so it couldn't possibly be me.
And without any spelling mistakes or typos, I can tell you as well.
So there you are, there's a clue, there's a clue.
That's just anyone who's completed pupillage, Joshua. It's the first skill.
So here is the clue. Secret Barrister says, I once ate 3 festive bakes in the space of 10 minutes and now have a visceral aversion to them.
Well, we'll all keep our eyes out. I don't know if that will ring any bells with the over 500 people on this and the more on YouTube, but you never know. We might have cracked it. Thank you so much, both of you, and to you, Joanne, of course. Really enjoyable conversation. And I think we're going to hand over now to some questions from the audience.
Hi. Thank you, Joanna. Yes, thank you so much, all the speakers. I mean, that was really enjoyable and great, and we're already receiving great feedback on Twitter. Thank you so much for that. So a few questions then. Firstly, we have a question from Emma Fenelon of 1 Crown Office Road Chambers. She asks, is the increasing public profile of former senior judges, Sumption, Hale, etc., problematic? So, Joanna, what do you think?
I think it has the potential to be. It depends. On one hand, we have a bunch of our best and brightest judicial stars who retire or semi-retire from the bench. They are, by definition, well-informed, well-educated, persuasive advocates. And heaven knows our media life needs people like that. But at the same time, does it feed into the narrative that we are so desperately trying to counter, which is that our judiciary is somehow driving forward political aims and political ambitions of their own? And I think it's a delicate balance to strike. Interestingly, right at the other end of the spectrum of our profession, pupil barristers saying, oh, should I have a Twitter account? Should I be offering political views? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? It's a new world for lots of us. And I think that the port drinking dinosaur profession of old would be choking on their port and their cigars if they saw the views and the how vocal the junior profession are. I happen to think that it's on balance and when measured a good thing. Should our most senior judiciary come out with incredibly controversial views on the lockdown, on the Supreme Court reforms? I think that a degree of measure ought to come into it when we consider the role they've held and some of the issues we have with addressing the criticism of it. So a balance is my answer to that.
Thank you. Joshua.
Yes, I agree very much with Joanna on this. The retired judiciary have an important role to play. So, for example, going back to the subject of my book, Enemies of the People, when that headline appeared, given that one of the enemies was the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas of Cwmgyrth, he was one of the people referred to in the title, and given that it's the role of the Lord Chief Justice to defend the judges, and given that it might have been seen as a bit off for him to simply go to his own defence to defend himself, it fell to his predecessor, Lord Judge, to defend him and to criticise the then Lord Chancellor Liz Truss for not doing what the judges regard as the Lord Chancellor's job, which is to not necessarily support the judges, not necessarily speak out in their favour, but at least explain their role, what they're there to do, and basically make sure that the criticisms are at least countered by others. Liz Truss famously said it was not her job to respond to the press in that way, but it was her job to support the judges, and Lord Thomas made that very, very clear in public. So the judges do have a role there. Whether Lord Sumption should be expressing his views on the way to tackle the pandemic is quite another matter. He's perfectly entitled to express his views on how far judicial review should go, how far the law should go, how far judges should be allowed to develop the law, how far they should be required to follow the Human Rights Convention, all of which he's expressed his views on. But I'm not sure that he has any particular expertise in the science of coronavirus and fighting it. I'm sure he would say that he is simply looking at this as an informed layperson, and he is not seeking to give scientific advice or scientific opinion. But I do think that because he is a retired judge of the Supreme Court, retired justice, his views are given greater weight than they would than the views of somebody who was not in that position. And I do think that former judges, and bear in mind he's still on the reserve list, he could still be called back to sit till he's 75. I think former judges should be quite circumspect in talking about matters of public controversy.
Thank you. SB.
The Secret Barrister says they agree with both Joe and Joshua. I, for one, am nervous about Lord Sumption's reincarnation as a newspaper columnist and an anti-lockdown campaigner. It makes it very difficult for us to argue against the claims that judges are politicised if the minute they retire they assume public roles as critics of the government. I think they have a valuable contribution to make to public life, but I would rather they do so in, for example, as crossbenchers in the House of Lords. Lord Newberger and Lord Judge, for example, I think are paradigm examples of how retired judges can enrich public life without exposing themselves to charges of politicisation.
Thank you. So we've had quite a few questions about obviously the attacks on lefty lawyers and so on from the government. So, and we've discussed that already. But one specific question. So someone asks, what is your view on the role of the Attorney General in this? So has Suella Braverman been deserving of the criticism she has received? Joanna.
I think that it's been at times a very different tone of criticism, and although I have disagreed with a lot that this government have done, I would never wish to encourage a tone of criticism that is unpleasant and beneath us. And I think that that's a comment on tone rather than substance. At the same time, I think that if you are the Attorney General, and if your profession, from both where you've come and from whom you are something of a figurehead, is attacked in a way that is beneath the office of those who are delivering those blows, and which can have real consequences. This isn't, in my view, about a load of lawyers sitting around on Twitter with their feelings being hurt. There might be a bit of that, but there's people out there who are frightened. There's people out there who run immigration law firms. They run asylum seeker law firms. They run law firms that assist people who are in need. And they do it on a shoestring. They are not making huge amounts of money. They are not living glamorous commercial solicitor lives. They're working hard in difficult circumstances, doing difficult cases for sometimes unpopular people. And if those people are frightened because an opinion or an atmosphere or a tone has been whipped up by people who should know better, then in my view, there would have been nothing wrong with the law officers in Parliament speaking out. And I think that their positions would not have been weakened by that. I think that they would have been made stronger because people would have thought, well, you've been appointed to this role and you're taking it seriously and you're not willing to bend your every word, your every phrase to an acceptable form of words for whoever your boss is. You really take seriously the role that you have. And so I would have loved to have seen a full-throated, wholehearted defence of those people. And I didn't hear it and it wasn't forthcoming. But at the same time and in the same breath, we ought to always show as much respect as we can in the tone in which we debate these things, because I think that it weakens our argument if we are arguing that people have whipped up hatred, if our response to that is equally unpleasant.
Thank you. Joshua.
Yes, I agree with Joanna entirely. The law officers are in a very difficult position. They are appointed by the governing party. The Solicitor General and the Attorney General are both Conservative MPs. It's very difficult because they are not members of Cabinet. The Attorney General is not a member of Cabinet. She attends Cabinet perhaps all the time, but only by invitation. And what we're asking her to do is to criticise, in this particular case, not only a senior Cabinet colleague, the Home Secretary, but also the Prime Minister. On the other hand, there are ways in which you can show your independence, because one of the other roles that the Attorney General has, I believe, is leader of the bar. And she attends meetings of the Bar Council and is still leader of the bar. How long that can continue, we wait to see. But I think as leader of the bar, she is fully entitled to say publicly and loudly that this sort of thing isn't acceptable. She tended to take a compromise approach to say, of course, nobody should attack lawyers physically, but on the other hand, lawyers are not above criticism. So it's a pretty wishy-washy response. And I agree with Joanna, it would have been very attractive if she were able to give a lead to colleagues in government and say this sort of thing is dangerous.
Thank you. SP.
Sorry, just bear with me momentarily. The Secret Barrister says, I have been very critical of the Attorney General, and while I completely agree with Joe that we need to be mindful of our tone, I do think that she is living up to the fears that some of us expressed when she was appointed. She was selected, I don't think there's any serious dispute, on the basis of loyalty rather than legal ability, and regrettably, there have been repeated instances of failures to understand her role. Publicly exonerating Dominic Cummings, for example, appearing to forget that she was superintendent of the CPS, and so exposing herself to a serious conflict of interest. Refusing to speak out in defence of the legal profession, as Joe has expressed, has been a serious disappointment. Part of the problem, I agree with Joshua, lies in the dual nature of the Attorney General's function as part politician, part law officer. But a leader of the bar who refuses to defend the bar is no leader at all.
Yeah. So next, a few questions we received on this. So I'll just paraphrase it, unattributed. So generally the question is, can the panel suggest what legal writers, bloggers, tweeters, etc. people should be following for accurate reporting and comment on the law?
You want me to just hold this up, don't you? You just want me to say, Enemies of the People, published by Bristol University Press, available for all good booksellers, and even at a 20% discount if you order direct from the publishers. or maybe you just want me to mention my website, which you can look up, and somebody's very kindly tweeted, and I've just retweeted. No. Can I say that the reason that I started on Twitter was simply because there were some terrific lawyers who were tweeting, David Allen Green, who has many more followers than I do, but also Adam Wagner, who I've referred to. I'm talking about almost a decade ago now, before SB started. But of course, SB and one or two other barristers who are practicing, and lots of other lots of barristers, in fact, who tweet regularly and do blogs, and academics as well. There are some terrific academics. There is a great deal of information there. You don't have to rely on the newspapers. You don't have to rely on individual commentators, people who you think express the views that you support. You can look widely. There are primary sources available. Judgments are published instantly in many cases. Hansard tells you what's said within 3 hours of it being said in Parliament. There is a great deal of material. Read as widely as you can, and the more you read, the better informed you'll be.
Joanna.
I'm not going to list all of my favourite Twitter accounts that you should follow, but I did do a list on Friday of some women on Twitter who I think deserve a good follow, some quite underrated women who tweet in a very candid fashion, in a very engaging fashion. I agree with Joshua as well. If you're interested in a topic, read it in the Times, but then go and read it on Legal Cheek and get both ends of the spectrum, because that's how you really know what people are saying and how a story is being interpreted. Don't read the comments under the line. It gets a bit hairy down there, but it's important for you to read an article from a really experienced legal commentator in a very established newspaper, but also go and have a read at some of the fun stuff and see what people are saying and how they're interpreting things. Because when you're a lawyer, and if you become an advocate, a jury advocate, it will make your approach to those issues more rounded. And so always know the facts, always know the core, always, as I was taught, always read the judgment. But also don't forget that the reason why we're in this job is because it can be good fun and it can be really interesting. And so don't let it get dry. And so don't be snobby about your intake of news, and don't be snobby about your intake of people. As Joshua said, keep it wide and keep it varied.
Thank you. SB.
Bear with me for a moment. So they say, oh, too many good people to list. All the people I follow. I try to keep the number I follow relatively low, so anyone law related will be worth following, not just for the hardcore law, but for the fun stuff too, and Nigella for the recipes.
Thank you. So another quite a specific question now. What are the panelists' views on the role of lawyers and the way they have worked, the lawyers currently representing Donald Trump? So if people have been following that. Joanna.
Oh, it's been marvellous fun, hasn't it? It's terrible. You shouldn't sit around laughing, but some of the transcripts from some of the court hearings, it's like my anxiety dream. You know, some people wake up at night and they think that they're naked in an exam, or they wake up at night and they have other anxiety dreams. My anxiety dream is going into court, doing something that I've got absolutely no idea what I'm doing, and the judge saying to me, would you like the usual? And me saying, oh yes, Your Honour, the usual that all the other barristers have, and then him saying, what is that? Could you spell it out? Which is basically what happened in one of these cases. They asked for the usual thing, and then it turned out they didn't have the foggiest idea what it was, what the test was, or why they were asking for it. So I think that David Allen Green had great fun. He was really, really enjoying this. And if anyone wants to go and have a look, he's retweeted the sort of the collected highlights of some of the appearances there. But it just goes to show, I think, how different our legal systems are. I think that when you glance over the pond at lawyers having a crack at something that they're not necessarily experienced in for a political cause, and then similarly you see that their ultimate backstop, you see references to judges who've been appointed. It's a very different system, and it makes me look around at the lawyers we have and the judges we have and think that maybe things aren't that bad.
Thank you. Joshua.
Yeah, you don't usually have, what was it, a hair dye malfunction, do you? If you're wearing a judicial wig. No, that must have been just a little bit embarrassing for Rudy Giuliani, I would have thought. you might have thought that he would have preferred to be as anonymous as SB. Now, it is interesting what Joanna says about how our legal systems have diverged. On the face of it, they look very, very similar. It's common law jurisdiction in the United States, but you really wouldn't get this. The other point is worth bearing in mind, which is the cab rank rule. In this country, David Pannick, Lord Pannick, was appearing in the Supreme Court over the past couple of days for Shamima Begum, who, according to his opponent from the same chambers, Blackstone, Sir James Eadie, is a terrorist associated with Islamic State. A threat to the United Kingdom, somebody who can't be allowed back into the United Kingdom even to fight her case. But she can get somebody like David Pannick acting for her on legal aid rates, and she will get the best possible argument that can be put for her. Whether it will win or not, we shall find out. But she can get the best possible argument because the traditions of the bar in the United Kingdom are such that you are not identified with your client. I think that those traditions don't really apply in the US, or if they do, they don't work out in the way that they should.
Thank you. SB.
Trump's lawyers, they have almost made the last 4 years worth it. Like Joe says, it's an anxiety dream brought to life. I'm not familiar with the ethics governing US lawyers, but what appears clear to me from a lot of the transcripts is the complete absence of evidence to support the submissions being advanced, which would make their conduct potentially a serious professional breach in England and Wales.
Thank you. So I think, there's lots more questions coming in, but we'll probably draw it to a close there. Just one last question. It's just coming in by Shoaib M. Khan. It's mainly for SB, but I guess the others can answer. What's your real name? Joanna.
I'll tell you a story about the Secret Barrister that I probably shouldn't tell, but we tried various methods of this evening to ensure that the Secret Barrister's voice was communicated to you all. And obviously, Joanne, being a facilitator, it has worked beautifully. I think everyone will agree, and we're grateful to her. But our first try involved a voice disguiser, and so we'll never know the Secret Barrister's real name, but I have heard their disguised voice as a terrifying robot booming out into my kitchen, which is a fate we didn't inflict on all of you this evening. And so whilst we might not know their real name, we might not hear their real voice, I think that we can agree that Joanne has done a splendid job this evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have had the pleasure of interviewing SB about SB's first book. This was on my radio program Law in Action, which you mentioned, Joanna. And we didn't have a voice distortion as such. We simply got an actor to read out SB's words, and very well the actor did. Whether that gives you any clues as to SB is another matter. Whether we were deliberately trying to mislead the listeners by providing a voice which was very different from SB's, again, is something that one may speculate on. But it was a great privilege to speak to SB, and that's all I intend to say about it.
Thank you. SB.
So I actually have been given some information. I've been given 2 names. I'm not sure whether you're supposed to choose one, but the 2 names are Joshua Rosenberg and Joanna Hardy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much to all the panelists. It's been amazing having you all here. And yes, it's been a great event. Thank you so much. So just before we close, to formally close the event, I'd like to invite the chair of the Human Rights Lawyers Association, Professor Aileen McColgan QC, who is a barrister at 11 KBW and currently chair of the HRLA. So Aileen.
Thank you, Shoaib. I have been listening with delight. It's been an absolutely staggeringly wonderful event. I'm a massive fan of Secret Barrister, but I'm also and I see a massive fan of Joanna Hardy, and indeed Joanna Kane, as well as Joshua Rosenberg. So it's been completely wonderful, and Schwab has done an astonishing job in putting this all together. So I just wanted to say thank you very, very much from the HRLA, and thank you to everyone who's come. I think it must be, by some stretch, our biggest event ever. So it's the penultimate event of my chairing of the committee. So I take full credit for all of the success. So thank you very much indeed. And I really encourage anyone who isn't already a member to join the HRLA. We're very good value. So thank you again, and thank you, Schwab. Thank you all the speakers, and thank you everyone who listened in. Thanks a lot.
For anyone who's still here, the Secret Barrister just wants to do one final shout out to Joanna Hardy's mum, and we'll leave it at that.
and I want to say how much I admire Secret Barrister as well.
For sure, I thought you were going to say that you also admired my mum. Just everyone should give my mum a shout out.
Next time I see her in court, I shall say you must.
Not as the defendant. She comes to watch me in court. For anyone that didn't understand that reference.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye,
everyone.